Well, thanks very much, Holly. That's a really interesting keynote. It raises an absolute load of different things and insights for us to think about during the start of this Innovation Day. So I'm really excited today to introduce to you someone who's been here since the very beginning of the serverless movement, really one of the founders of everything that you know about serverless, and he's the general manager of Lambda here at AWS. I'm happy to introduce to you Ajay Nair. How are you doing, Ajay, this morning?
I'm great, James. It's a great day to innovate with serverless.
It is.
Yes.
So Holly makes mention in her keynote about the idea of a serverless portfolio. And back in the day, serverless was just Lambda. So how do you think about serverless today?
Man. Starting with the definition of serverless is quite the way to get into this discussion. But to your point, James, I think when Lambda came on scene, there were various ideas of serverless already floating around, right? Like the concept of being able to delegate operational management or undifferentiated lifting to the provider was always something that was out there. I think what's really happened since the beginning, and it's been 9 years since we kind of launched, is the concept of serverless has really embraced and grown to be much more about that sort of operational model, where the idea is that you're delegating the well-architected fundamentals of your application primitives over to providers such as AWS to handle on your behalf. And I think what's been really fascinating to watch is we have gone from essentially a single compute, maybe a storage primitive or a queue primitive, to the idea where everything that you need to build an application, from functions to queues to databases to workflows, have come out with sort of this as a service concept where all the aspects are managed on your behalf. And you have these powerful ways to compose them together. So when I think about the AWS Serverless Portfolio, it is about the idea that you have this really one of the most breadth of service selection in terms of primitives that you can use to build your application, as well as a really rich ecosystem of tools that you can use to compose those together and govern them together. So everything from the venerable CloudFormation to things like the serverless application model, or to our ecosystem partners like Terraform and Datadog and others, you have a plethora of tools that allow you to kind of govern those together. So when I think about the portfolio, it's really about the selection that you have for building applications the serverless way to achieve the business outcome that you talk about.
Now you mentioned 9 years, and the T-shirt says 9 years, and so it's been actually
Almost.
a long time.
Yes.
Do you still feel like the new kid on the block?
Oh man, there are a lot of war stories, and it does sometimes wonder where the 9 years have passed as it stands. So I'll tell you this, James, what still feels amazingly wonderful is when you talk to customers and hear the stories about the thrill of them moving from idea to production so quickly with Lambda, right? There's a customer I hear about recently called Cinch from the UK, who launched a new e-commerce startup looking at used cars in less than 6 months using a serverless stack, which would have previously taken them a couple of years to pull all the concepts together that go over there. We have single people companies that are getting launched in weeks to go and turn things around. So for me, on one hand, you look at it, we have reached a point where serverless is sort of the norm, right? Like we don't have debates about we have debates about what is serverless or not, but we don't have debates about Lambda or otherwise. It's all about what's the best tool for the job and moving forward over there. On the other hand, you still have people discovering it for the first time and realizing the power of composing services together in event-driven and other ways to innovate on behalf of their customers. So that value of being able to move fast by doing less is still quite amazing and fascinating. And so, among the 1 million customers and more that we have, the millionth and first customer who comes on board saying, wow, this is amazing, that still makes me feel pretty cool and new. So
yeah, and one of the most amazing things to me since working here is just how many customers we have and the absolutely massive scale of some of these workloads. So for our audience today, can you give people a peek under the covers and give them a sense of how you manage that kind of scale on Lambda?
Yeah, so as Holly mentioned, we're looking at 1 million plus customers running about tens of trillions of requests a month just on Lambda alone, and even more on when you take the combinatorial portfolio altogether. And in the past, I've joked with my team about how Lambda and serverless really is the compression algorithm for AWS's experience in owning and operating these large-scale services. So if you think about it, like just for handling the scale we talked about, Lambda alone has 80 plus odd services that are going on in there. And for each of these 1 million customers, we're essentially acting as handling their infrastructure operations and service operations on their behalf in a way that is compacted without having to duplicate 1 million operation teams that go. And these are massive scale customers. You have customers like Capital One to others like HBO Max, who are serving 70 million customers using their Lambda and event-driven systems that they have today, while maintaining sort of the well-architected fundamentals that they care about. So for me, that kind of the ability for us to operate at that scale, the fact that we have such a diverse set of customers, is the thing that really makes it possible for us to drive innovations like Firecracker, like SnapStart, because we're able to have deep visibility across such a heterogeneous set of customers and workloads in order to drive innovation up and down sort of the stack and get those efficiencies, right? Like, it's not efficient if you are creating, again, 1 million ops teams or 1 million teams to go and handle infrastructure on behalf of customers. It's efficient when you're able to use technology as the accelerant to kind of go and do that over there. So for me, the sheer variety of customers and scale that we're operating at is sometimes still mind-boggling, and the kind of capabilities that we're able to ship on their behalf is remaining really cool. I will actually say what's a very interesting problem space that still deals with us every day is the fact that for each of those tens of trillions of requests, how do you maintain a 99.95% SLA out there? That's 52 minutes of downtime in the course of a year.
Wow.
For across tens of trillions of requests. You're talking about maintaining a latency overhead of the service on typical things in the tens of milliseconds of range quite consistently. So, there's a lot of science that we talk about in some of our more deep dive sessions that goes into making all of this happen. But all of that energy goes towards making sure that customers don't have to deal with those fundamentals, and we do it on their behalf.
Yeah.
So.
And you talk about a lot of the customers of many, many different types of workloads. And I think all the developers out here know that there's no one size fits all for everything, that there are always trade-offs when you make technical decisions. And that's why we have serverless containers and serverless functions. But if you're new to this space and you're deciding between which one do you choose, what advice would you give?
Well, always start with Lambda, right? It's a good question, James, and one that a lot of our customers often debate with and work through. The first thing I'll always talk about to customers is understand your context, right? I tell my team and customers often that context wins over dogma every single time. If you come in with the mental model that I must use X, Y, Z, whatever it is, be it Lambda, containers, or otherwise, you will always run into a challenge at some point when the world around you shifts, right? So if you think about it, there's various dimensions of that. There's the skill set that you're bringing. What is your team experienced on? That's what's going to help you move fast. There's the business context in which you're operating. Is there a lot of churn? Is the environment around you changing? How much speed and innovation do you need, or how much extensibility do you need? There's the aspect of what's driving your priorities at that particular point. Are you in a year where you're trying to gain new markets, or you're trying to kind of compress and compact and play things sort of safe? So for me, that's what makes the bigger decision more than the aspect of the technology itself. And the technology flows from your business needs as it stands over there. So in general, the serverless operation model is designed for speed, right? You get on board, you're doing less, you're moving fast as much as it goes over there. You're delegating and partnering more with AWS to handle on your behalf. Serverless versus, I don't particularly enjoy the serverless versus containers framing for as far as I'm concerned. Containers have an amazing story to tell with respect to the developer tooling that they bring to the table. Lambda supports OCI images, whether you're running on, and same thing when you're running on ECS Fargate as well as you're running on Lambda. We have a set of customers who kind of choose their tools together. Capital One and Nike are great examples of people who do that. And for me, the choice then boils down to aspects like price-performance trade-offs that look at that particular workload. If you're looking at, say, a Lambda-specific aspect, you would say, if I'm looking at something that's net new, that's designed for extensibility, event-driven architectures using Lambda are a great fit. If something is extremely I/O-bound, I'm coming in an environment where I really deeply understand a container orchestration, and otherwise you would probably start with ECS Fargate. But the general guidance I always tell customers is start at the highest level of abstraction that you can, right? Like do the least amount possible to get to the outcome that you're trying to get to, and then move forward from there, right? It's about how you're starting and not fixating about the fact that where you start is where you stay. You must be open-minded to say architectures evolve and one size doesn't fit all.
Yeah. So in that, I want to talk about cost, because that's really a question I think a lot of people watching would be interested in hearing about. So serverless really introduced this idea of this pay-per-value approach. But we hear from some customers as they start to get to larger scale that it starts to get expensive for them. So how do you think about the running cost of software?
Well, how much time do we have, James? Right. So it's it's a question I wrestle with myself, both in terms of being a large-scale operator myself. And there are various dimensions I guide customers to think about this. So when you think about the paper model that serverless brings, oftentimes one fallacy that customers fall into is they compare it with the cost of owning a hosted piece of infrastructure or owning a box, versus what serverless is actually. I guide them to think that you're actually paying for the idea of using the box rather than the box itself, right? So in some ways, there's this concept of utilization that gets baked into it. So, conventionally, a rough rule of thumb I give customers is, if you're thinking about comparing costs, you can compare a on-demand, fully AZ resilient or availability zone resilient EC2 instance fleet running at about 23 to 25% utilization is about the break-even point where running the same thing on Lambda would look like for you. And I think that's where a lot of the mental modeling of, it works at scale, it works at certain workload patterns and all comes in, because there's an implicit assumption that when customers are running at a certain point of scale or a workload hits a certain point of scale, there's an implied benefit on sort of running the utilization. And in often cases, that's true, but that's work, and that's not implied, right? So the guidance I typically give customers over there is, yes, that there will absolutely be a situation where you need to look at that particular dimension of scale and say, is this still make sense for me to delegate that utilization decision down to Lambda? But more often than not, it's not a given, right? You will find a change over there. Now, in the situations where you do have Lambda scaling up, there are tools like tiered pricing that Lambda offers and SQS offers, savings plan that Lambda offers that allows you to mix and match savings of compute that sort of changes that cost curve as you move up front as well. And you have many customers who are running hundreds of thousands of requests on us today, with large-scale footprints that are comfortably happy with the infrastructure costs that they're getting over there. Now, there are workload patterns that don't fit well, right? So event-driven architectures and Lambda architectures typically tend to be a lot of service-to-service communication. So in situations where you have a large spread of services, a lot of data being moved back and forth, it probably doesn't make sense for you to spray it out that way. We often talk about don't use Lambda to transport, use it to transform, right? Like Lambda isn't designed to be moving data back and forth. There are other better suited, more cost-efficient ways for you to go and do that. So there are some obvious patterns over there. Check out serverlessland.com for those, that you can kind of get those pieces out over there. But the other dimension of cost, really, independent of the infrastructure one, is where it talks about the cost of ownership, right? And people often ask me, how do you measure the cost of human efforts? And you joke about it being, in sunsets and coffees and cups of coffee, right? So the cost of human element is a huge difference over there, because oftentimes what people misconstrue in these is the cost of doing that efficiency work, the scaling work, and all those elements play a huge part in terms of where your investment is going to drive that innovation that you see on your behalf. I think there were estimates from Deloitte that see about a 403% ROI with respect to the investment that you put when you're building on serverless at that particular point. We have seen internal estimates or customers say anywhere between 30 to 50% reduction in TCO, or total cost of ownership, at the point of using something like serverless technology. So net-net, when you think about cost, yes, there are aspects of infrastructure. More often than not, it's not as binary for me as you get to scale, think about it. Oftentimes it's a factor of how utilized can you run the infrastructure that you're running at. And the second element, there are workload patterns that may not sort of quite fit. Absolutely make sure there's documentation that guides you about it. And then third, have a balanced view about both infrastructure cost and cost of ownership, so that you're making a more holistic decision on what's best for your business and your context.
Right. So when it comes to optimizing a serverless workload, how should you think about this? Is this something you should do once or think about doing often? And if so, it's often, how frequently would you approach this?
So I think similar to security, I think of cost optimization as a shared responsibility, right? There's a set of levers that AWS will handle on your behalf that you can optimize. We will take care of the unit cost for it, like we talked about how to run the infrastructure, boiling it down to a single baked-in cost of serving or executing your code is handled on your behalf by AWS, right? Or transporting an event, as the case may be. But now when you're talking about an application, the model shifts when it comes to serverless, right? You have all these serverless primitives composed together, all of them talking to each other using aspects like HTTP requests or events. So for me, cost optimization in a serverless world shifts from talking about how do you tweak your per resource cost, which often than not is about tweaking the resource allocation on it. So it may be how much bandwidth are you allocating for transport, how big do you want the payloads to be. In the case of Lambda, it could be how much compute are you allocating for the per effective resource that you have over there. The second big dimension typically tends to be how information is moving back and forth between those services. So those could be aspects like applying the right filters so that the right events are being transported between services, so you're not unnecessarily paying for transport over there. Looking at dimensions like batching and grouping so that you're doing much more holistic views of what you're doing versus it being too granular. And in general, sort of thinking about how the services interface with each other, whether there's even a requirement for those services to exist, right? This goes back to, I've seen customers, for example, talk about using Lambda in a set of places, again, to connect two services together where there's a direct connectivity better. So oftentimes, the reason to kind of constantly look at optimization is AWS is constantly making service connectivity easier and better, right? We have had situations where the two step functions expansions for the selection of workflow endpoints that they had is a great example where a whole set of functions that they previously required or other ways to join that were no longer required. That's a cost saving, and those are implicit that comes in. Some of those we'll give you for free when the 1 millisecond billing kind of thing rolls around, but others, a constant exercise of optimization is certainly a good idea to go and do. And there are tools both from AWS and partners like Cost Optimizer that show you opportunities to go and do so, and it's a good practice to make sure that we keep helping customers to use them.
So one of the things that most drew me to serverless when I first discovered it, and I've found in the last few years of being here, is how closely associated it is with innovation. So here we are with Serverless Innovation Day, so that's an example. But why do you think in customers' minds that serverless and innovation are so tightly intertwined?
So I will say innovation often is tied deeply with speed. Right? And it varies depending on where you are in the phase of your business. I've talked to customers in their early stage for whom it's speed of experimentation. They need to try new things to figure out what is the right product market fit that they have. You have others in a slightly more later state where they're trying to remove barriers to growth, right? They're removing their next big bottleneck in either scale or selection or something else, and they need to quickly extend or expand their capabilities that they offer. And then oftentimes when you look at customers who are more mature, their bottleneck tends to become what investment do I put my people in? So it becomes a people cost that shifts that around. So independent of which stage of product you are, what I've found is serverless adds value for you. When you're talking about using serverless technologies in your early stage, the rapid pace of innovation you get by delegating capabilities down to AWS is really, really powerful. We have entire companies out there who have spun up and created businesses around it. When you're in that stage of expanding your business, the fact that you build an event-driven architecture to improve your selection or using the scaling capabilities that serverless gives you so that you don't have to worry about it removes another bottleneck for you to move fast, right? And therefore innovate on behalf of your customers. And then at later stages in your business, the fact that there's an entire slew of people who are freed up from their responsibilities by adopting a serverless model now gives you an opportunity to then broaden your frame of innovation that goes over there. So for me, the fact that serverless technologies add the ability for you to innovate no matter what that innovation mode looks like where you are over there, that's where sort of the coupling comes in for me. And again, that's also the area that continues to delight me today on all the cool new things that people are able to go build with it.
Yeah. So we said at the beginning that you've been here for really since the dawn of this. So I have to ask before we wrap up, where do you see serverless going for the next 5 years?
The crystal ball question as it stands. So. I've said this before where I like to think that we are kind of at the end of phase one of serverless, right? The concept of being able to run with delegated responsibilities of application primitives on various providers is sort of well understood there. People get the agility and cost benefits that you get with it. And you're already seeing this massive point where you have a pretty good selection of primitives, right? I think we are shifted to that world like serverless has become the primitive, so to speak, for going and building net new as it stands over there. So for me, the innovation forward comes in a couple of ways. So one, I do expect that we will continue to drive changes on the next layer of undifferentiated heavy lifting, right? Maybe that's network transfer, like what we did with VPC Lattice. Maybe it is some other dimension. Maybe whatever the next frontier is, that will become part of the broader serverless definition, and the primitives themselves get stronger, helping customers accelerate up. The open-ended area, which is really the one that's exciting for me, is what happens when composing these services together in new experiences. So you have things like App Composer, which have made it super easy to pull it together. But with the rise of new surfaces like large language models and others, I'm just excited to see all the ways the serverless primitive becomes sort of part of the new OS, so to speak, to build things together.
Wow. Well, thanks very much, Ajay, for joining us today. I hope you'll stick around for the rest of the presentations and demos we have. There's certainly a lot coming up ahead. So we're going to take a very quick break, but then we'll be back with Eric and Jessica. Thanks very much.